Debuko, and good morning, colleagues, partners, and speakers, as well as participants. My name is Samantha Isaac, and on behalf of the Southern African Liaison Office, I'd like to welcome you to today's multi-stakeholder dialogue under the title Advancing a Just Transition in Southern Africa. Thank you for taking the time to join us. The transition towards low carbon and climate resilient economies is already reshaping questions of development, employment, energy, industrial policy, environmental governance, and social protection across Southern Africa. The central issue is therefore not only how the region responds to climate change, but how this transition can be pursued fairly with workers, communities, young people, and those most affected being able to influence the decisions that will shape their lives and livelihoods. This dialogue has deliberately been framed broadly to provide a space to consider the policy and practical dimensions of a just transition, including poverty, inequality, employment and decent work, climate action, green industrialization, critical minerals, conservation, youth participation, and community voices. It also offers an opportunity to reflect on how stronger regional cooperation can support approaches that respond to Southern Africa's shared challenges while recognizing the different national and local contexts. So our purpose this morning is to bring together perspectives from labor, civil society, environmental governance, conservation, and green economic development. We hope this discussion will help identify areas of convergence, questions that require further attention, and practical opportunities for a more inclusive regional engagement on the just transition. We're joined by a rich panel of speakers, and I'd like to thank them each for agreeing to contribute to this discussion. The session will be jointly chaired by SALO's Lwazi Somya and Marisa van Rensburg, who will guide us through the speaker inputs as well as the discussion that follows afterwards. I won't go into the procedural points, but if you've been in a SALO dialogue, you kind of know the game by now. But I'd like to thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to an open, thoughtful, and constructive discussion on how Southern Africa can advance a just transition that is environmentally sustainable, socially just, and responsive to the region's development priorities. I will now hand over to our chairs to begin the session.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you. And I will be giving as Sam did, I will be giving a shortened version of my my intro for the sake of our first speaker, who I'm very grateful still made time, even though he had a unexpected flight to Mongolia, and he's speaking from the airport. So all protocol observed. Thank you. I will just very briefly. I don't wish to eat into his time, but thank you for everybody for joining this important event. Obviously, in the context of the SADC summit coming up this weekend. It's a very pertinent topic. El Nino coming up. We know that this is a very important topic. I won't delve into that, and I'm not one of the experts you came to see. But just to very briefly, I'll give you a sliver of his esteemed bio. But our first speaker, who is speaking from the airport on his way to Mongolia, is Dr. Valanavo Kavagali. He currently serves as the country director of the IUCN South Africa. And the regional head. He's also the regional head for climate change in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, providing strategic leadership on program development, partnership, and resource mobilization. I will get into other housekeeping business after we have Vali's input. Don't wish to eat into the minutes of your time, Vali, if you would take the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, SALO. Thank you so much, Samantha, for putting together this discussion and this conversation. As I've indicated, this is one of the very interesting conversations that we should be really spending more of our time talking to it and also exploring more opportunities in terms of where are we going with regard to the just transition conversation. And also just a minor correction there, but it's a major correction, which is important. I'm not yet a doctor, but still working hard to become a doctor. I hope in the next few months, I could be able to use that title officially. But thank you for that honor. So yes, indeed, my work in IUCN as the country head is to also support the different conversations with regard to climate change, resilience, adaptation, and also looking at the conversation with regard to renewable energy in the region. We know just transition has always been one of the key issues, not only just transition, but also just energy transition. However, one of the things that has been happening with the Just Transition Conference is to understand that it's more than just moving away from fossil fuel. It's all about creating opportunities, decent jobs. And if you listen to the conversation from the mining unions or the unions, they're also talking about creating decent jobs. We are looking at strengthening communities, reskilling communities, and building a more inclusive economy. From the IUCN perspective, for the natural resource perspective, we are saying we need to be doing all those elements. We need to be just going through the just transition while we're also protecting nature, because this is the backbone of all the activities that needs to be done. So nature and biodiversity are part of the region's economic foundation. You look at SADC, for example, we have had some of the harsh weather conditions in the past 5 to 10 years where we've been hit by the extreme weather patterns. If it's not drought, it's flood. And this has got a very detrimental impact in terms of socioeconomic livelihoods. It also has got an impact in terms of economic diversification and also the natural resource base that we have. So we look at opportunities with regard to healthy wetlands, our river systems, our rangelands, our forests. How much resources can we draw from these particular ecosystems? They do have got a greater support in terms of water security, which you know is a big currency in the SADC. We need to talk about agriculture, which is also a very biggest sector in the SADC region. Tourism, for example. I mean, you cannot talk about Botswana, you cannot talk about Zimbabwe, South Africa without including ecotourism. And obviously the rural livelihoods. In the nature of our countries, we are so solely dependent in terms of even building the different sets of livelihoods that are actually supporting the rural communities. Therefore, investing in this ecosystem restoration, managing our land sustainably, so exploring opportunities around nature-based solution helps us to create jobs that also strengthen resilience. What does this mean? It means that we cannot use one size fits all, and we need to explore different opportunities. For example, SANBI has got a very great program on ecosystem-based adaptation. How do we expand that, and what are the limitations of that? We have to look at nature-based solutions. When we now start thinking about the grey infrastructure, we look at urban settlements. How do we then interface ecosystem-based adaptation and other responses that will support in terms of building resilience? Therefore, we also need to look at, while we're talking about the just transition, there's always has been a fear factor to say, well, people are going to lose jobs, communities are going to lose opportunities. But we must also look at a just transition that will protect workers and communities, because the changes in the coal and mining sector will then have to give us other opportunities. This means we need to invest in reskilling our communities. We need to look at social protection. When you're coming up with new sets of ideas and projects, then you must also look at the economic and social measurements that are important for safeguarding the livelihoods of the communities. This means also looking at opportunities that will support local businesses, alternative sources of livelihoods. You will know recently there's been an issue in Botswana, particularly with the diamond sector. That calls for Botswana to start thinking quickly. What are the alternative sources of livelihoods away from diamonds? So that means we need to look at new opportunities in terms of new industries. And we need to find out opportunities in terms of how many jobs are we going to lose? How do we replace those particular jobs, and what kind of opportunities which will be developed and identified and will be owned by the communities that are today are the ones that are on the losing end. So this is a very important element to say, while we are looking at the just transition, how do we reskill our communities, make sure that they are involved and they are key role players in the diversification of this particular economy, or this new kind of economy that we're building on. So one of the things that we need to also look at is that countries in the SADC region, they need to work together. I mean, we are rich in terms of minerals. How can we enrich and also explore and expand the value chains in the region? What is the kind of shared infrastructure that do we require to make sure that we can also create more opportunities? What sets of skills are required to move forward? And we can then start drawing our own standards, environmental standards. how do we then align our environmental standards with the development priorities of the region? For example, now there's quite a lot of opportunities that are coming up with renewable energy. What does that mean? What does it mean in terms of our rangelands? What does it mean to the agricultural sector? What does it mean in terms of the regional development plans? Because each and every country in the SADC region, they do have got their own national development plans. And then how do we also look at the trans-frontier conservation areas or trans-frontier ecosystems? Because we've shared waters, we've shared borders, we've shared natural resources. Your Kruger National Park, your Greater Limpopo Trans-Frontier Conservation Park, your Kalahadis, your Rextersveld. These are shared natural resources with other countries. How do we make sure that when we build onto that, we are also making sure that we are harnessing other opportunities that are there? So some of the key messages that are really critical for this is that we don't have to choose between development, nature, and jobs. We need to build a transition that needs to be able to deliver all the three. One, we need to, at the center of this, we need to have communities. Right there at the center of this conversation, we also need to look at what are the value creations that we need to build, and then what is the environmental sustainability element. If you check most of the private sector, they do have a very big component on environmental sustainability under the ESG, environmental, social, and social governance. This is very critical because they know to build sustainability, they must have elements that they're actually assessing the standards that they need to follow. Why can't we apply that? So the real measure of success for this, it will be to ensure that we reduce inequality, we create decent jobs, we protect ecosystems, and we do not leave any other communities in a very unfortunate position. So they must be better prepared for the future. That means the youth must be involved. That means the local organizations must be involved for co-ownership. That means we must also have a conversation with our local municipalities, district municipalities, and provinces to inform conversation. So there's a greater global demand in terms of critical minerals. You've seen the conversations that is happening globally. The priority at the end of the day is that we need to make sure that there's local beneficiation. We cannot always be seen exporting. We must be able to process and manufacture this. Look at the skills. Look at the jobs that we need to recreate in the region. And this must be matched with the environmental safeguard. Can you imagine that you are having in the future, we've got a very beautiful South Africa, but we do not have the best of our ecosystems. We lose Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden. We lose Kruger National Park. We lose some of these national botanical gardens that are the centers and are the refuge for some of the key species areas in the region. Rextersveld, for example, the Sutherland Karoo, the Cape Floristic region. What kind of a future will we build if we do not have such beautiful ecosystem that helps us to say we can actually admire, and we know that our legislation can help us in terms of dealing with environmental safeguards. The other element is also to look at responsible mining. How do we ensure that while we're busy dealing with the extractive sector, they can also contribute to rehabilitation and protection of these sensitive ecosystems? For example, our water resources, they are very sensitive. Look at our wetlands development that is taking place in those particular areas. So we need to be very critical to indicate that we cannot go and just develop without taking into account the natural resources. And this is the conversation that I think we need to build. And in terms of development, we need to build in terms of the just transition, and also making sure that we can tie then together opportunities like your water, energy, food nexus, your nature-based solution opportunities. And we can be able to bring the adaptation and mitigation interface strongly to make sure that in terms of policy, it's there, in terms of science, it's there, and also in terms of practice, it exists, because we are so much rich in terms of information that is available to me to enable South Africa and the region to be able to address this particular conversation. So thank you very much. I think this is the conversation that we should also take up for the Africa Energy Indaba, to make sure that we are bringing the different sectors, key role players in the region to contribute to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kavagali. Thank you so much. And safe flight. Thank you. We're really grateful you made time from literally on the way to Mongolia at the airport. So thank you for your wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And again, apologies. We understand, but we will miss you in the question and answer session. I'm sure we will. There's people who would have wanted to engage, but we are so grateful that that you still made time to engage. Thank you. Safe
Thank
flight.
you so much.
We
can take some questions, and I will see if I can be able to respond to them later.
Oh, okay. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. Hopefully
Thank
that's
you.
possible. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then
Cheers.
thank you. Moving on to our next speaker, who I will then introduce more fully without the time constraints. Our next speaker is Ms. Boitumelo Molete from COSATU. Boitumelo is and has been for several years the Social Development Policy Coordinator at COSATU, Congress of South African Trade Unions. Boitumelo leads work on climate change and the just transition, and serves as the Organized Labour Commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission, the PCC. I'm sure many of you have engaged with, and represents Organized Labour at National Economic Development and Labour Council at NEDLAC in the MANCO and EXCO, as well as the Development Chamber. Boitumelo also serves on the Presidential Just Energy Transition Funding Platform, the Department of Higher Education and Training JET Skills Advisory Forum, on the NBI JET SEP Advisory Board. She's recognized among the Mail and Guardian's top 200 young South Africans, 2004, and has represented workers at the UN under the banner of TUNGO, the UNFCCC process from COP 2026 to 2030. Ms. Molete holds qualifications in politics, industrial sociology, labor law, and project management, and we are very honored to have you speak today. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, Boitumelo. Apologies, Boitumelo is straddling two events, as is post-COVID life for many of us. I will just give her a call quickly. Oh, sorry, Boitumelo, I see you're online. You're online. Would you mind? Yes, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you very much. And apologies for the glitch. I am in another setting. So thank you very much for the introduction. I think just for context and to introduce myself once again, my name is Boitumelo from COSATU, and I will basically be taking you through the perspective of workers in terms of the just transition and climate change. I just want to thank you very much for the invitation, and also acknowledge that it's quite good when workers get the opportunity to sit in platforms that are outside of the trade union movement. It allows us to share our ideas. It also allows us to converge with other very aligning or similar perspectives, which also guide us in our interventions, both at the level of the institutions you mentioned or sit on, but also at the international level and the United Nations frameworks on climate change, UNFCCC. So I think convening this dialogue is extremely important for the opportunity for us to bring that perspective. And I just want to emphasize the perspective of workers on the just transition, as it not only speaks about moving from high emitting sectors into a low carbon and climate resilient economy. It's really about how we manage the economic changes that will come, and ensuring that while we do manage those economic changes, we're not leaving workers behind, and that we are also considering that outside of workers providing their labor to the employers, they also have families and communities that they come from that need to also be considered. For the Congress of South African Trade Union, the principle is quite clear. It's straightforward that there cannot be a just transition without aspects of decent work, of social protection, worker participation, as well as economic transformation. So workers should not be asked to choose between the environment and protecting their livelihoods. The main objective here is to achieve both a just and equitable transition for workers, where we are ensuring that we're moving from this carbon-intensive industries and recognizing that workers are not opposed to the transition. And I always want to frame that when speaking about the just transition in relation to workers, is that workers are not saying they don't want to transition. They're saying that we are seeing this transition is taking place. Our sectors are changing. The world of work is changing. But we also need to make sure that we are securing the environment and ensuring that the environment is sustainable. What we want is to make sure that while we're balancing these, that the transition does not then consider workers just as a byfactor of the transition. So workers through this just transition discourse need to be considered, because one of the main aspects, and COSATU will speak about it, is on job losses and how insecure workers are in sectors that are being suggested as potential sectors to transition to. In COSATU's Blueprint for Workers, we speak about agriculture as a potential sector for workers to transition into. Now, while that is quite realistic, we are also quite aware that the sectors may be precarious in their nature. And if these sectors are precarious in nature and you're taking someone from mining into agriculture, how are we going to ensure that workers are guaranteed decent wages? They're guaranteed conditions of employment. They're guaranteed that legislation will be observed in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act as well. So we want to make sure that we are not just moving sectors for workers that are high emitting into low carbon sectors. We want to make sure that we are not losing the quality of jobs that already exist, and that we are making sure that the aspect of reskilling, upskilling, and skilling is observed and is prioritized as a critical enabler to a just transition for workers. There cannot be sufficient measures in place if the employer, the state, and workers are not in communication and are not in dialogue that is meaningful. We can't achieve a just transition if these are not put on the table, if clear measures are not put to ensure that workers are not left behind. And we use the loopholes of the sector precariousness to ensure that we are covering workers going ahead. So what then we need to do is make sure that even these new jobs that are coming in these low emitting sectors are jobs that can be protected, where income is guaranteed, where rights are observed, and that workers will not have a life that is going to be of a lower quality. Another part is that we want to make sure that there are these guarantees that are being provided to workers that will ensure that they're moving to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. One of which would be protecting jobs from the onset, as I have said. The other would be ensuring that we have adequate social protection measures in place for workers that will be affected by the transition, that we are putting reskilling and upskilling as a critical part of the transition, and that there is redeployment where it is possible, and that the redeployment is one that is funded fully by the employer. It is very important also to know that the state has a responsibility to create legislation, to develop legislation and policies that will protect workers, one of which is one that we're working on at NEDLAC, where I sit as a representative of organized labor, to say that we want to have an addendum to the Labor Relations Act of South Africa, which is a document that protects workers. But in that LRA addendum, which we have coined the Just Transition Code of Good Practice, we want to make sure that it is spelled out that no worker should be left behind, that it is important for workers to be protected by the legislation of the state, so that we know that this transition is protected for workers. This Code of Good Practice on Just Transition is currently sitting at the Labour Market Chamber in NEDLAC. And we specifically wanted to take it into the Labour Market Chamber because this is a labour market shift that requires for us to adequately be able to respond, not only saying that no one should be left behind, but saying that we want policies in place to protect workers, but also to assist employers to transition adequately and make sure that they're considering workers. Another very important part is that while we're building these new industries, we don't want to have this green economy is coming and it must be patient. We must be patient. We want to know how many jobs are going to be created. Where are these jobs? So outside of all of the preparations, there also needs to be a very concerted effort to having skills analysis, a skills gap analysis, as well as ensuring that we are making the jobs that we are promising workers quantitative. So it can't be a qualitative discussion. We need the numbers on the table. How many jobs are going to be created? How many people are going to be transitioned through to these new jobs? And how many do we need to then assist into retirement? Ensuring that while they do that, we are making sure that social protection is also being provided for these workers. So in simple terms, the just transition for workers is one where we are going to be meaningfully discussed with on the plans of the future, both at the level of the workplace as well as the level of government. And at this stage, I can confidently say that the South African labor movement has had the opportunity to be part of various social dialogue bodies and the institutionalized dialogue where we are being represented, one of which is the Presidential Climate Commission. It's at NETLAC. We also are part of the Just Energy Transition Funding Platform, which sits at the presidency level, and various other state institutions or state initiatives, including the one of the Department of Higher Education and Training's Skills Advisory Forum. So there is some effort from the state to make sure that workers are at the table and they have equal opportunity to speak on the just transition and to put ideas on the table. We've done a lot of policy assessments, policy developments as COSATU. I can share the link in the chat where you can basically see that COSATU has not just started speaking on just transition of late because it's a thematic or it's an interesting thing. COSATU started speaking about these issues as far back as 2011. We have a policy titled Just Transition to a Low Carbon and Climate Resilient Economy. We have the COSATU Blueprint for Workers that is used as a tool to prepare workers and as a tool to have those demands put in place. And we are advising sectors and unions to use the blueprint as a collective bargaining tool. We also have just recently developed the toolkits for workers on a just transition that will be presented in the highest decision-making body of COSATU, which is the National Congress, coming up next month. So there's absolutely a great amount of work that unions are doing domestically in South Africa, also regionally in Africa, alongside the ITUC Africa, and also in the UNFCCC with the ITUC Brussels, alongside the UNFCCC processes, where Tungo is a critical part of representing workers in the international aspect. So I think my message to this sitting is that colleagues must be very much aware that unions and workers have articulated themselves. We are reclaiming the just transition, noting that this was a concept that was developed by workers. We're reclaiming the just transition. We are saying that we are at the table. We are doing this not only for our current workforce, but the future workforce. You will also see how we speak about the importance of education and training in our efforts. So it's very important to understand that while industries are changing and we are seeing these green industrial strategies, workers are at the table, workers want to see local beneficiation, workers want to see that this transition does not leave anyone behind and does not leave us worse off. So we have the capacity at the level of policy, we have the ability to influence and lobby. In South Africa, COSATU specifically has the privilege of being very in touch with the state, and we are able to get some intel into the planning of the government. But yet again, we are still saying that our efforts to negotiate at the federation level is for us to make sure that at the level of the affiliates, at the level of the workplace, workers are protected, workers know their rights. Enforcing the impacts of just transition on workers without protections is something that we are guarding against. It's something that we want to make sure that we mitigate against. But we're here to call for a just and equitable transition for workers and communities, and that we want to see this not only being measured to move to a low carbon economy, but also as a developmental agenda where the communities, the workers, and those that are most marginalized are able to be accommodated for, including gender and youth, where a lot of my work is focused on. So that is where we are as COSATU in the just transition efforts. And I think these type of settings as well encourage us to be able to want to exchange with people from across sectors and across institutions so that we achieve a holistic, just and equitable transition. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm here to take any further questions, engagements. Papa is always open to these. And if colleagues on the call have an interest in knowing what workers are saying or doing in this just transition discourse, I'm more than happy to engage also outside of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Boitumelo. And that's aside from your excellent inputs, thank you so much. Very heartening to know that that workers are very well represented in South Africa in this transition. Very heartening to know, and reclaiming the transition, which has been used for many different at many levels, many different meanings. So that is very heartening to know. But also just to say, as SALO, heartening, thank you so much. That is fantastic. And I hope that colleagues in the room do take Boitumelo up on that, because that willingness to work across sectors, and as you know, the openness to civil society, that is fantastic, and that captures the essence of what we're trying to do here at SALO. We ourselves are not experts, but bringing different experts from different sectors together to break down the silos, which unfortunately do often separate, like the silos that Vali drew out, often the more environmentally focused colleagues at times can sometimes be at cross purposes without knowing of the colleagues who sometimes neglect the very important environmental aspects in favor of seeing it as a dichotomy when it does not need to be at all. So there's such value in cross-pollinating perspectives and ideas, and I hope colleagues do take Boitumelo up on that very, very generous offer. Thank you so much for making that offer. I will not summarize each speaker for the sake of time and engagement, because again, I'm not the expert that you came to see today. I will just then briefly move on to our next speaker quickly. Our next speaker is Dr. Mao. Oh, sorry, my video. Our next speaker is Dr. Mao Amos. He's the founder and executive director of the African Center for a Green Economy, a Pan-African think tank advancing inclusive, climate resilient, and sustainable economic development across Africa. He leads their work on climate finance, just transitions, green industrialization, and sustainable economic development. He has more than 18 years of experience, and Dr. Amos has advised governments, development finance institutions, multilateral organizations, and private sector organizations on climate policy, green investment, natural resource governance, and inclusive economic transformation. He's led regional initiatives on climate adaptation, energy access, and sustainable finance, and regularly convenes and facilitates high-level policy discussions involving government, business, civil society, and development partners. Dr. Amos holds an MSc and a PhD in conservation biology from UCT. He graduated, he previously served as an adjunct associate professor at UCT at the Graduate School of Business, and currently serves as a trustee of the Table Mountain Fund. So without further ado, Dr. Amos, can you please take the floor? The floor is yours.
Hello, hello. Good morning. Can you see me?
We can see you and hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Marisa, for the invitation, and thank you to SALO for convening this very important dialogue. And greetings to my fellow panelists, whom I know quite well, Boitumelo and Vali, whom I've known for many years. Really good to be here. And so I don't have a very long presentation, but I just want to highlight a few important issues. One is that for me, the starting point is that Southern Africa's transition is not taking place in a social or economic vacuum. It's unfolding in a region facing deep unemployment, inequality, energy insecurity, fiscal pressures that we all know, and growing climate vulnerability. What this means is that the transition cannot be treated as a narrow exercise in replacing one energy technology with another. And I think the previous presentation clearly outlined how, for example, workers are very critical to this conversation. And if we simply replace coal, for example, with renewable energy, while leaving patterns of ownership, exclusion, and regional inequality unchanged, we may achieve energy transition, but we will not have achieved a just transition. I think that's really a very important point that has already been elaborated by both speakers, that it has to be a holistic transition. It has to be a transition that leaves no one behind. And more importantly, it has to be a transition that recognizes that we live in a resource-constrained world, and therefore we need to protect our natural capital. And for me, I believe that when we think about the element of justice in the transition, justice has to be seen in at least 4 places. It must be visible in who participates in decisions, in who owns and benefits from the new economy. I mean, South Africa's history tells us the importance of ownership and why it's very important in this type of conversation. But not only that, it also in how risks and costs are shared. Because what we don't want is that South Africa is a very highly unequal society, that when we transition into a much more sustainable economy, basically the losers of the current economy will bear the burden of the cost as we move forward. How do we build a society where this risks the risks that are in transition can be equitably shared by everyone? And in whether transition investments produce tangible improvements in people's livelihood. It's one thing to say, hey, we have invested so much amount in X, Y, Z, and so on. But if the material well-being of people on the ground has not changed, then we will not have achieved this just transition. And in the services and economic opportunities that the transition creates. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll all agree with me that Southern Africa does not lack policies, strategies, or declarations. For example, South Africa has, the Just Transition Framework, an investment plan, and even an implementation plan. And across the region, countries are developing renewable energy, strategies, critical minerals implementation plans, green industrialization, climate resilience strategies, etc. The challenge is the distance between these national ambitions and what workers, municipalities, local enterprises, and communities experience on the ground. It's one thing to create these lovely, glossy policy documents, statements, and so on, but ultimately, it's what happens on the ground. Do these opportunities reach to the man on the street? And that, for me, is the test to check whether just transition actually works or not. And for me, this is what I describe as a missing middle in the transition. The institutions, partnerships, and delivery mechanisms that convert policy into investable projects, capital into implementation, and implementation into measurable outcomes on the ground. And I think that we have been part of this conversation for many, many years. Every year, the African Center convenes a dialogue. We have been, following this discourse for many, many years. In fact, we were founded in 2012, and I would say my entire career has been spent in this space, and we've seen how the dialogue has moved over the years. But when I go to Kuruman, when I go to Priska, where we've done work there, when I go to Mpumalanga, the message coming on the ground is the same. Where are these opportunities? When are we actually going to participate in these processes? How do we ensure that these benefits actually bring a difference in our livelihoods? So we are really faced with a big challenge of how do we ensure that implementation happens real on the ground, but even more importantly, how do these resources flow to the ground? For example, South Africa's energy transition investment plan illustrates the scale of the issue. It is estimated that South Africa requires at least 1.5 trillion between 2023 and 2027, while the original implementation commitments was about $8.6 billion. It was meant to be catalytic, but the crucial point is not only the volume of capital. It is the nature of that capital. How accessible is it? Which projects become bankable? and whether resources reach municipalities, enterprises, communities, and how those opportunities will be delivered on the ground. I think the University of Wits did a few years ago around the just transition and looked at how the funding has actually been distributed. A lot of the funding ended up with consultancies, advisory workers, and so on, but not really reaching on the ground. So there's the issue to talk about how much money do you actually need and whether this money trickles down to the ground. So the point I want to emphasize here is that the finance debate must be beyond asking how much has been pledged. We must also ask how much has reached implementation, on what terms, who can access it, and what local capabilities and supply chains does it benefit, and what outcomes can affected communities actually see. And I think that Butimelo mentioned very clearly here, for example, in terms of the types of sectors where workers are expected to take up these job opportunities. Are they sustainable? Are they able to provide job security? If we say, for example, agriculture is the new frontier for the transition, how can you ensure that workers who go into that into that sector are actually taking up jobs that are sustainable? How do you ensure that we improve productivity in that sector so that those workers who have lost their jobs in let's say in the coal sector can be able to move into sectors that are much more sustainable, etc. So at AfriCIG, at the African Center for Green Economy, our work across Southern Africa has reinforced 3 practical lessons that we have learned over the years. First is that consultation is not the same as participation. What we have found is that in many communities are oftentimes invited to comment after the main parameters of a project have already been decided upon. Meaningful participation requires access to information, influence over choices, and an ongoing role in monitoring of delivery. We find that many times by the time communities get consulted, a project has already been designed, has reached a financial close, and then communities are brought on board to say, like, hey, we're going to be doing X, Y, Z. What do you think about it? And for me, I think that's too late down the road. Communities need to be part of the engagement process, part of the decision-making processes. They must be able to play a very meaningful role beyond, this rubber stamping approach that we see very commonly. Second, skills development cannot be separated from actual demand. There's a lot of training programs that are proliferating around. And oftentimes these trainings are very hypothetical in terms of green jobs that are perceived to eventually accrue to these communities. Skills programs must be linked to real investments, pipelines, to employer commitments, procurement opportunities, and pathways into employment or enterprise. There's no point training, workers, training, community members, and so on, when there's actually no direct links with jobs, direct links to jobs or direct links to procurement processes, to project pipelines that could actually benefit. So it's one thing to train, but we need to make sure that training programs within this space are actually linked to demand, so that when people get skilled, they know the pathways through which they are going to go in to participate meaningfully in the economy. And the third thing that we have noted over the years is that local economic development cannot be treated as an add-on to major transition investments. What do I mean? Local procurement, for example, supply chain development, community ownership, social protection, and enterprise support must be designed into the investment model from the onset. When we say we're going to invest X amount in a particular location, we need to think about the local dynamics about that community and how they are going to be able to participate in those processes and how they can translate those into building resilience locally. I've worked in the Northern Cape, for example, in Priska particularly. What has happened there, it's absolutely heartbreaking. A lot of the farmers there essentially are trying to lease their land to these massive renewable energy plants. And so what they're doing is they're laying off workers who are traditionally in the agricultural sector. And you go to Priska, you find a lot of people just sitting around idle, and not only idle, hungry. It's so heartbreaking to go to a feeding center where by 10, people are already starting to queue for food that is going to be served at 12 at one, and so it's so depressing. And we should not allow that the transition should not create a situation where people lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, and end up so despondent like that. It's very heartbreaking. And for me, those are some of the issues that I feel sometimes are not talked enough in terms of this energy transition discourse. It's very important, but we need to know who is bearing that cost, and understanding that becomes very critical in how do we allocate the risks associated. And from the broader Southern African context, regional cooperation is going to be equally important. If our countries negotiate separately, only as suppliers of raw materials, for example, land or renewable energy resources, we risk reproducing the extractivist model under a green model. Oftentimes, I attend a lot of renewable energy conferences here. If you look at who is actually exhibiting at these conferences, you find it's all manufacturers from Asia, from Europe, and so there is no local actors that are actually meaningfully participating in this renewable energy value chain. So localization, I think, has been raised. It's very, very important. If we don't industrialize, if we don't take our critical minerals and add value locally, we will end up as supplying raw materials into these value chains without creating local beneficiation. And one of these important aspect to that is this idea around how do we ensure regional cooperation so that these countries can support each other to beneficiate some of these critical minerals. And so regional cooperation, and I'm hoping that through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, South Africa and the region can really work together better to build the industries that are needed to drive the transition. And by that, it will help us to build value chains, coordinate infrastructure, develop common capabilities, and negotiate a greater share of value within the region. We attend a lot of these climate change conferences, and in those climate change conferences, it's really important to build a coalition. It's important to speak with one language. If, let's say, Zambia, and we know Zambia has got vast, copper, deposits, but might not have the infrastructure to add value to that copper. Can't Zambia talk to South Africa and say, how can we collaborate in making sure that we add value within the region before exporting these raw materials into Asia, for example? And so that regional cooperation, I think, is very critical in terms of how we drive the transition beyond South Africa, but across the region. But for me, ultimately, the transition will be judged by delivery. Can we point to workers who have moved into secure livelihoods? That is going to be a measure. Can we identify locally owned enterprises participating in new value chains? Can communities see improvements in energy access, municipal services, and economic opportunities? Can we show that biodiversity, land, and water have been protected rather than sacrificed? So for me, and I think this has been said earlier on, that the choice is not between climate and development. The real task is to design a transition in which climate action becomes a vehicle for development, inclusion, and economic transformation. And for that, it requires us to connect capital, evidence, and implementation, and to keep justice at the center of all of this. And for me, I think that we have not reached there. And if you look at how we talk in silos, you find civil society having their own conversation, private sector having their own conversation, the public sector. There's so much noise in this space that it's difficult to see how we're going to build a holistic transition that is going to result in the development of this region. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's all my remarks. I'm open for questions. Thank you so much.
Apologies, technology malfunction. Thank you so much, Dr. Amos. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there will definitely be questions for you in the question section at the end of this the panel. I just want to say sorry because I cut just the few remarks I wanted to make to frame the discussion. I cut that short because of Vali unfortunately had to speak very and that's the window. But I just want to say I'm very glad that you contextualized that. That's exactly how I wanted us to start this dialogue. Just to say that often something that happens and it's understandable when it happens in Oslo or well, let's say America, but I think that we I would hope that colleagues in the room from the region can all try, many of you are, of course, but in different spaces we're in, if we can just try and forward the framing, I think it's on us in the Global South, in this region, to always ensure, and as Boitumelo said, that the term that they're reclaiming the term just transition, but that term can mean so many things to so many different interest groups and different people. Interest group sounds nefarious. It's not obviously most of the time not nefarious, but basically for us, yes, we need to do this just transition in the region. Sorry, I'm abusing the chairship, but this is something your input really. I was glad you gave the historical the framing that yes, we're doing this just transition, but of course it needs to be done alongside and not. It needs to not overtake the task before us, the post-colonial, post-apartheid task of development, but development that redresses historical wrongs. And just to say that, yeah, that is definitely a real, the way that SALO sees the just transition. It really is, it needs to be done. In our region, in the Global South, we need to work with partners to ensure that all framings of just transition aren't just about protecting current jobs, because that definitely is not where the bar is. Current jobs, we're in a job crisis. So we're not just trying to protect current jobs. We're trying to redress past wrongs. We're trying to basically, we're still in the process in the region of, we have not remotely reached our post-colonial aspirations. And the just transition needs to be, as you said, Dr. Amos, it needs to be a vehicle to reach that transformative development. We're not just trying to protect the level of development that we have right now, because that's certainly not enough, not where we need to be. So there we go. I will not abuse the chairship anymore. I will now introduce our next speaker, Kundai Ngwena, who has spoken before for SALO. Thank you. We're excited to have you again. Kundai is a climate change advocate who focuses on women and gender and children. It's just transition, energy and climate diplomacy. Her advocacy involves working with children, youth, women, and persons with disabilities. She has a diverse work and academic background, including being a qualified metallurgy technician, media and communications practitioner. So without further ado, Kundai, the floor is all yours. Kundai, you're on mute and your camera's off, just by the way. There we go, unmuted, great.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here and for bringing me on board to share my insights. Apologies for joining in a bit late and also for dropping off a little bit, but I think I'll try to turn off my video so that we won't have disruptions in terms of connectivity. So I'll be also coming in looking at the aspect of children, youth, as well as various contexts of youth, including persons with disabilities around the mix in terms of just transition that we are looking at. So to start with, I would actually agree with some of the remarks that you shared, Marisa, in terms of the components or the multi-sectors that then feed into the just transition, to then say they all have their different definitions or context and all that. So that being said, now, I think one of the things that we also need to revisit as Southern Africa is to look at a broader context or a cross-cutting way of identifying ourselves with how just transition is described or is perceived, because there are various angles to it. For example, when you look at the aspect of children, beginning of this year, through the Africa Center for Governance, an organization I'm working with, we had an informal survey with the children, asking them some of the careers they intend to be riding on or to be known for, or they have to, in looking at their prospects. And most of the careers that they presented to a greater extent, they are not directly linked with just transition. Yet just transition is the future that is being envisioned. So you already, and you'd then be able to pick to then say, okay, if their prospects are not falling in within the JT context, then are these children positioned to be at to be having the future they are looking at? So there comes that discourse that we also noticed. Then from there, now when we started, when we hosted a virtual careers forum for with children that were all over the country, we then realized that their narrative actually shifted. Now realizing that even if you want to do engineering, but renewable engineering or solar engineering, whatever it is, can be something that you can put into context. So it is something that we have since started engaging, and we are looking at making it maybe an annual or even a regional project going forward. But when you look at this now, it's something that you then realize that our education curriculums, as much as maybe we are advancing them, or we are building on what existed, or shifting the narrative to suit the current context of national development, which is what Zimbabwe has done. There's still more in terms of then trying to see how we position the future with how a child is thinking right now. When you also look at some of the students in tertiary institutions in Zimbabwe, we have what is called the Zimbabwe School of Mines, and it actually serves the Southern Africa, the SADC industry. And as it serves the SADC industry, story for another day, I'm actually a former student from Zimbabwe School of Mines. When we were still there, when we were taught and all that, we are actually taught about extractives and some of these processing methods of all the resources that do exist in Southern Africa and in Africa. So you find that when you then say to that learner or to that student to then say the call that you're being taught about is actually not the future of tomorrow, it doesn't make any sense to them. So you find that discourse now that is there, when you look at the other side of this, the value chain of things, it's something that that ought needs to be revised in that context. So, and when you look at now, looking at our core, some of the core mines, they actually offer scholarships for students. So if you then say to that student that this core mine will cease to exist at some point in a certain future, they'll be like, what then does it mean for people who are aspiring to be recipients of scholarships? So there's a whole lot to be considered in terms of, like I rightfully said in one of my introductory statements, to say, I guess we need to revisit how we are defining this JT, to make sure that it suits our context first before it suits the context of anybody else from elsewhere in the world. And when you look at now the communities, they have direct and indirect benefits from these from these fossil fuels that we need to transition from. When, for example, some of these mining communities, or mining companies rather, have managed to construct schools, construct hospitals, support football teams, support maybe sports teams, not necessarily football alone, even support, create maybe these small to medium scale financial institutions or financial support, something like that. So this is how such communities resonate with these mining companies that are involved in extraction of these fossil fuels. This is how they look at them. There's also the other bits to then say there's aspect of environmental issues, the air, the health issues, and all that. But they are then focusing on those other aspects of the direct or indirect benefits they can derive from there. And then we also have people who will be selling a lot of selling foodstuffs, groceries, whatever it is, to some of these miners. And some of these miners, they are actually they are customers, they are day-to-day customers. So you find that when we are now talking about JT to such kind of people, to them it's more like extracting a certain part of them economically. It's not necessarily something to do with the environment or something they can relate. Imagine, just think of a child who's being taken to school, both parents or both guardians, whichever way, working in a fossil fuel extractive company or organization, whichever context. And then you say to them that this must be closed. To them, it's like you are saying their future is shattered because they cannot exercise their right to education. So people that are now being able to define or to look around perspective of JT and all that are then leaving these people that are directly affected or they are directly involved in these processes. And then when you look at the African context, countries have signed and ratified the African Free Continental Trade Area. And one of the agreement rather, and one of the fundamentals of trade is energy. And we then see our countries talking about advancing the establishment of oil refineries or commitments towards oil refineries expansion and all that. So you find that these are resources as Africa that we already have so that we can develop. If we are to talk about electric vehicles and all that, we are talking about technology transfer that is going to come from elsewhere for us to be able to then say we are now having these EVs and all that. So I'll continue to say that there's need for us from the global south, from Southern Africa, from Africa, whichever context, to be able to push a perspective that suits our own context. And like the previous speaker, the doctor has said that we have so much of these policies, documentation and all that. And most of these documentation, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they're actually derived from commitments maybe under the UNFCCC that have to be put in place or put together. But the question is, are we also getting an opportunity to be able to push our own narrative towards that end? That then suits our own context. They've come from that place before. And it's also now time for us to be able to take ourselves to that, to utilize this and come from that place. I've been reading quite a lot around the United States of America, China, India, and all that. They've actually come from that place of using coal, of industrializing, using coal and using all these fossil fuels that then today are being said to be transitioning away from. But we are then saying as we transition, we must also be very careful because we could be also transitioning with economic benefits, with social benefits, and also with cultural benefits. We could be transitioning with all that. So if we are transitioning these all benefits, it means we are simply taking away all these benefits away from us. So I think as I just close up my submission is that Africa must write its own story and then take its written story to the world, and as opposed to the other way around, because the other way around, they are not, some of them, they've never been to Africa. So that can tell you something. In Santa Marta, some people were thought Africa is just one country, and you will be like, so if you are then talking about transitioning away, we must transition and all that. If you don't know how Africa is looking like, there's a lot of discourse that then needs to be re-looked into if we are really going to make this process something that is fundamentally anchored on humanity. So thank you so much, Marisa. I will leave this time back to you. I'm still around.
Thank you so much, Kundai. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And again, I won't abuse the chairship, but that's so pertinent, the points you made. And I couldn't agree more about the need for a regional narrative of the just transition that's shaped by the region, especially the youth of the region, and rather than just taking an imposed version that, for multiple reasons. I mean, I would never be, I'm not anti-science, but one could almost say that the science, we've got enough hard climate science. We actually now need to work on the communications, the diplomacy, the climate diplomacy to really just get the message out there, and that climate is that this is a bread and butter issue. So thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I will now introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Ntombi Mapapu. She's an experienced policy and research professional, currently serving as the Senior Energy and Climate Justice Coordinator at the Southern Africa Faith Communities Environment Institute, SAFC. In this role, she collaborates with faith leaders and green champions to advocate for a just transition to clean energy and to implement and the implementation of equitable climate policies across South Africa and the region. With a significant background in parliamentary research and government policy, Ms. Mapapu previously served as a researcher for the ANC caucus in South Africa's parliament for over 8 years. Additionally, she managed the EU-funded project for the Presidential Climate Commission, which prioritized stakeholder engagement regarding South Africa's just transition. The results was the report's Stakeholder Perspectives on Engaging with South Africa's Just Transition. This work involved extensive stakeholder mapping and analysis to improve community engagement on the transition process. Thank you. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Ntombi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marissa and SALO colleagues. And thank you very much to everyone for the opportunity and affording SAFC the opportunity to present on some of its perspectives on the just transition and particularly the just energy transition in this context. So just by way of introduction, my name is Ntombi Mapapu, as mentioned, and I lead the Energy and Climate Justice Program at SAFC, the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute, and we are a multi-faith regional organization that works with faith leaders across the region. We do a lot of work around Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, a bit of East Africa, South Africa, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia, and we hope to extend our tentacles throughout the continent on advocating for a truly just and sustainable transition. And just by way of introduction, SAFC has major programs. The one that I lead is the Energy and Climate Justice Program. And our work in this program is to realize a just transition that is accessible, affordable, and sustainable for all. And this includes having faith leaders and communities from the region working in creative spaces to learn from each other and galvanize collective action, recognizing the unequal impact of climate change on those least responsible for emissions. The second program that we have at SAFC is the Food and Climate Justice Program, where we promote nature-based farming, including agroecological systems, where we advocate for sustainable, equitable alternatives to factory farming, industrial agriculture, and genetically modified food. In this program, we work towards empowering communities to promote sustainable consumption and to help build climate resilience. And the third program that we have is Animal Justice, which advocates for humane and compassionate world where the rights of all beings, including wild and farmed animals, are respected and upheld. So in this program, our primary campaign is the Cage-Free campaign, which calls for an end to using battery cages in egg-laying farms. And the last program is the Faith Leader Environmental Advocacy Training, which is our flagship program called The Fleet. This is where we train our faith leaders and community members in a peer learning platform that empowers people of faith across the Southern and Eastern Africa to advocate for environment and justice in communities. And I'm mentioning all of our programs by way of introduction to say that we use all these programs to advocate for a just transition and not just a just energy transition. But I know that by segueing, I will most probably speak about the energy transition. So our flagship campaign this year at SAFC is called the No Faith in False Solutions campaign in all of our three programs. And this program and this campaign is a campaign that says, we're saying to governments across the region that we as communities, as faith communities and as civil society are advocating against false solutions, against the climate crisis as well as the transition. We're advocating for true alternatives to a transition in the region. And one of the milestones that we had this year is that we submitted a civil society-based memorandum called the No Faith in False Solutions to the National Parliament of South Africa, where we provide our various views on the false solutions as well as provide alternatives. And we're still hoping that we'll get audience from National Parliament on our submission. So by way of entering my presentation, is to mention that from SAFC, our stance at SAFC is documented in the advocacy materials and the strategic frameworks that we have. We'd like to say that we stand at a historic crossroads between destructive extractivism and a deeply healed society. For us, we're saying that we've seen the violence of extractivism from time immemorial, from the industrial revolution period to where we are, and we've seen the remnants of how that looks like and how that has played out in our communities. And as SAFC, our vision is for creation care. So we advocate for a morally transformed society, striving deeply for a deeply healed and equitable society. And we're saying that climate action is inseparable from social and economic justice. And by way of saying that, we're saying that for us, the true justice rests on three non-negotiable structural pillars. And the overarching goal is to ensure that the just transition is built on dignity, stewardship, and also equity. So this just transition, as seen in our policy positions here in South Africa, is that it must be based on the three justices. It must be based on distributive justice, where we have fair, equitable distribution of both benefits and burdens of the transition. It must be based on procedural justice, where communities are included in transparent decision-making and power is concentrated within the people. And we must have restorative justice that actively redresses historical harms and land degradation caused by extractive industries. And the foundations of this is ensuring that we collectively, as a people, dismantle systematic structures that place financial gain above human life. So dismantling systematic structures that prioritizes profit over people. As we're saying that, just think about the just transition, we are saying that what is missing, that ethical justice dimension should not be missing from the conversations. The transition is often framed too narrowly through technical and economic lenses. As SAFC, we're saying that there should be a lens that looks, or a framework that looks at eco-justice. So this eco-justice framework should view that the economy and ecology are inextricably linked, where the earth is a community of mutually dependent living beings and living organisms. It must explicitly address the intergenerational equity, the dignity of creation, and the persistent marginalization of women, persons with disabilities, and youth. So for us, the economy and our ecology form a single inseparable community of life. So when we speak about looking at the just transition from an eco-justice framework, we speak about, in the context of energy, that it is a constitutional right and should not be treated as a commodity. We should also be having conversations around intergenerational equity, which speaks to us as custodians for future generations, that we ensure that our children inherit a viable and also flourishing earth. It also speaks about the dignity of creation, of all creation, recognizing that living earth is a community of mutually dependent living things, and that there should be an ending of the continued exploitation of nature. And therefore, we're saying that there should be this inclusion of the marginalized, the rise or the reversing of the persistent exclusion of women, youth, and persons with disabilities, particularly from things such as energy frameworks. And one of the things that we've also spoken about is the view that we support decarbonization, but it should not happen in a form that worsens or exacerbates inequality. We are of the view that governments should move beyond rhetoric, and also to reject false solutions that exacerbate the climate crisis, that exacerbate inequalities in a just transition, which inadvertently also divert large or vital resources that lock our region into long-term debt and dependency. So I see in the chat there's been a lot of discussion about renewable energy systems, and our view is also that the transition should prioritize, but also we need to collectively, as a people, define what this decentralized renewable energy systems should look like for us. There is a lot of work going on in socially owned cooperatives. I know that Nelson Mandela Bay University and one of the townships in PA are working on a socially owned cooperative. When we talk about decentralized renewable energy systems, we also talk about mini grids and solar homes. But again, there is another conversation that talks about the price and affordability and accessibility of these alternatives that are being introduced. So one of the things that we are very explicit about when we talk about the just transition, just and energy transition, is that there is a need to narrow the energy access gap, and we need to have more conversations about combating electricity poverty. So perhaps, Marissa, there should be another further to this webinar. We should have a conversation about how do we narrow, in the context of the just transition or the just energy transition, how do we narrow the gap or close the gap when it comes to energy access and also energy affordability and also energy poverty. So we need to talk about how do we have conversations on that when it comes to just energy transition or the just transition, if you want to be able to speak more broadly. So I think the conversations that we have ongoing at SASLI is the conversations around rejecting false solutions to the just transition and also to the climate crisis. And the conversations that which is a thread which I've noted throughout all the speakers' conversation or inputs, is that we need to move from a path of dependency to a path of sovereignty. And we need to, as Africans, define what is a path of sovereignty for us. We need to talk about these decentralized renewable systems. What does that look like for us? How do we own them? How do we build skills to support them? What does local ownership look like? What do socially owned cooperatives look like for us? How do communities benefit? So how do we close this energy access gap? And also, how do we talk about the equitable sharing of benefits and ending challenges that are linked to access, that are linked to affordability? And then I'd like to also reflect that in the work that we do as SAFC is working on how do we involve faith leaders and communities in decision-making processes, because the influence that must be made must be one that is meaningful and must be participatory. So in the work that we do as SAFC, our work is to ensure that we advocate for energy democracy, moving power from into the hands of those that are most impacted, rather than merely consulting them after decisions that have been made. I know that Dr. Mao also reflected on this, and this requires asserting the right to meaningful, free, prior, and informed consultation to uphold the sanctity of local communities and the social fabric. So decision-making energy democracy says we need to move from having an extractive model when it comes to decision-making to an empowered model where communities can manage their own and govern their own priorities and manage their own local ownership structures. And therefore, it speaks to the conversation around how do we have, or what does a free, prior, and informed consent mandate look like for communities? Does it include having legally binding contracts on it before any projects can be implemented in communities? How does that look like, and where are community voices in the conversation? We also, as part of our presentation, are also submitting that affected communities are the architects of this transition, and this transition in this context needs to be supported by a united ecosystem, having communities as drivers of this just transition, having organized labors supported in this transition. And I know that Boitumen also spoke about this, that organized labor has been in the forefront of advocating for a just transition since 2011, which is true. So in this ecosystem of designing this transition as a country, as a region, as a continent, we need to have organized labor as a key tenant that ensures that the transition yields net gain in a secure, unionized, and community-based, ensure that there's community-based decent work. We need to have conversations with our governments to ensure that they move beyond rhetoric to transparent governance, ending corruption, and redirecting climate finance directly to grassroots communities. I know further discussion is also needed on that. What is that? Dr. Mao referred on that. What does climate finance look like? And can it be measured? What are the indicators for measuring that climate finance is actually working to the benefit of communities and advancing a just transition? Another important conversation that we also need is to speak with the private sector in defining the just transition that we want as a people, because primarily their focus is on profit maximization. We need to ensure that the conversation is also anchored around ethical value chains that honor environmental limits and human and environmental rights. And we need to have at the forefront, which is the work that we continue doing, is to have faith leaders speaking truth to power, using tools such as theological advocacy to mobilize congregations and communities towards being active architects of a truly just and sustainable transition. So in the region, in the context of energy, in the just energy transition, our domestic choices reverberate across our shared Southern African development community home. So when we speak about a just transition for all in the region, we need to speak about regional solidarity. And that involves speaking about policy coherence built on shared responsibility across neighboring energy systems. And we also need to speak about the environment. What does eco-justice mean? What does environmental justice mean in the context of the just transition? We need to ensure that we speak about how we take care and nurture our environment. We need to talk about nature-based solutions, ensuring that in the context of a truly just and sustainable energy transition, our domestic energy shifts do not leave our neighbors in the dark or force them to accept dirty and obsolete technologies. We also need to talk about having a just transition in the region that speaks about sharing strength, leveraging our collective regional power to confront high climate vulnerability and energy access deficits. And also we need to talk about what does the regional sovereignty mean for us when it comes to climate justice, and also when it comes to developing and designing and implementing a just transition in our region. So for us, it's about looking at how we can work towards a grant-based financing system and ethical mineral stewardship. So we need to have conversations around moving from finding ourselves or trapping ourselves into debt-inducing loans to grant-based climate financing. So we know that our region and our continent faces constrained fiscal space restrictions. We must also assert our rights to development without sacrificing our sovereignty, our national sovereignty, and our regional sovereignty and continental sovereignty, or our children's futures to international debt traps. We also must speak about ethical mineral stewardship. There's been a lot of discussion about beneficiation. We need to talk about how do we draft and design a comprehensive regional pact on minerals, on our critical minerals. So we must actively counter extractive colonial era patterns. If we talk about a pact, we must talk about how do we design a pact that mandates local beneficiation, that is strict on environmental safeguards, and also protects the rights of workers, and also is embedded on absolute community consent. And in rounding off my presentation, I think for the region, when we speak about the just transition, we need to talk about how do we, in the context of energy, how do we commit to energy sovereignty? How do you commit to the sacred right of communities to directly choose and manage their own renewable energy sources? So part of this is also discussing policies, what goes into policy integration. And importantly, we must, as part of the conversation on policy integration, mainstream JETSI, we must ensure that gender equality and disability and social inclusion principles are implemented or exist in all frameworks, ensuring that this transition that we're talking about leaves no one behind. And this transition cannot be built on false solutions. It must be built on ethical, meaningful, and empowered participation of the people that intends to serve, honoring the duty of faithful stewards to living earth and all its inhabitants. And in closing off, I'd like to just submit a quotation that was made by Tatenda Muponde from the Center for Environmental Rights. He's a lawyer. He mentioned that a just transition is not about replacing coal with renewables. It is about transforming the systems, the very systems that have produced and reproduced inequality in the first place. So when we talk about the just transition, it's important to embed conversations around inequalities and how do you transition ourselves, our communities, away from inequalities to a transition that is truly sustainable, truly ethical, and also it is affordable and accessible to everyone in the country, in the region, and also in the continent. Thanks very much, Marissa. Handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Ntombi. That was such a rich presentation. There's so much there, and the interest in the chat. I can see there's a lot of people with questions for you. You've got a speaker engagement if you haven't seen in Gauteng. Hopefully you can make an invitation. I will hand over, for the sake of time and to foster the engagement properly, thank you to all our speakers, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Lwazi Somya to facilitate the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Captain Marissa, for stewarding the ship so far until we've gotten here. But now I'm interested with handing the second half of this discussion, where we open up to the people and participants of this discussion to deliberate on the interventions made by our panelists. And part and parcel of that is seeking what are you thinking in terms of the region's approach towards a just transition and issues around climate justice? I know there are a lot of comments in the chat so far, and I also encourage the people who are making comments to please raise your hands too to make your contributions to this discussion. One of the missing elements that I picked up in this discussion is that a just transition itself is not just a transition, an energy transition. It is also a technological transition that we are facing. As we have seen more recently, greater automation within the mining sector is happening within countries such as China, greater automation within the high labor intensive sectors such as agriculture too. If you look at the numbers alone in China in 2013 alone, China had a workforce of 5.3 million people in the mining sector, and now there's 2.3 million people within the mining sector. And it's not just necessarily for a just energy transition aspects of it, but it's just for the mere main nature of automation and the utilization of automation. And as companies seek to enhance their profits within the current period, lessening the worker burden to them, it will prove to be more profitable and actually attaining these technologies and machines to conduct mining. So what happens to those communities in the transition on technologies too? Because how the SADC leaders have framed this initiative in terms of a just transition, it is they place it squarely on how Africa enters on the issue around critical minerals and how beneficiation needs to happen within Africa, the creation of regional value chains and the facilitation of those value chains towards the exports. And in a sense, this has then turned into an extractivist debate and how extractives should be treated, rather than how do we now create economies of the future. So I've opened the discussion up, and people can freely raise your hand. The button is at the bottom of your screen, and as soon as you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. A secondary aspect of the discussion that I feel that is missing is private sector accountability. And then we raise the issue around distributive justice. And a lot of the time, the notions around who are the sinners in terms of climate change, we always point to the North, but the role of multinational companies and the lack of rehabilitation or post-mining has a deep impact within Southern Africa, and especially within South Africa. As you've seen, the lack of rehabilitation has facilitated the process towards the creation of zama-zamas, for example, which has resulted in huge community security and risk threats, as wars between the informal artisanal skilled miners and the role of multinationals within that sector also needs to be taken into consideration, and how we utilize our natural resources to benefit humanity, and rather at the expense of humanity and the environment and the social good. The other element that we can touch on is how the lack of a regional protocol and its implementing agents that the SADC Summit is trying to deliberate on is in existence. For example, the current protocol on mining has been in existence since 2000, and it is before the critical minerals rush within the SADC region. There is a critical minerals framework, however, that's not implementable because it's not a protocol and therefore cannot be it's not legally binding. And the additional aspect of it is that even if there was a protocol concerning mining and a just transition, the inability to take regional actors to court because of the dysfunctional nature of the SADC tribunal has created a situation of regional uncertainty in terms of governance around critical minerals and general governance within the region. So all these factors are at play as our leaders within the SADC region are meeting in Durban as we speak, deliberating on the future of this region and especially are concerning how do we now ensure that the future of jobs is secured. So I'm still waiting on colleagues and Soraya, I see your hand is up. May you please come on to have your contributions, please. Over to you, Soraya.
Thank you so much for this. I'm a grassroots activist. I've been with SAWID since it started in 2003, and then we transitioned to EWADI environmental, that we're concerned about children and the environment that is so dirty and drug infested and all that, but also the water. But at some point in some years ago, we had Bankeroy and leaders from universities, and the late Vuyo Matlati Mashireti St. Peace asked us to engage. And that is when Bankeroy came and said to us, okay, fine, there'll be an MOU if we can find grannies, and the solar grannies would be taken to India in some place so that they can learn how to put together solar panels for areas that are off the grid. They must be off the grid, and that is the input that the 4 women went to India. Unfortunately, we didn't know the conditions, so it was a bit difficult. But we've been trying about this that you've spoken about. Everybody has spoken so beautifully. I wish that we would get the recording so I can share it with the EWADI team, because we really, really need to do so much more for the youth in making them employable. But also, we have a military base here, and we want to have that military base transformed into a peace center and training center and rehabilitation center and everything that we can think of. Unfortunately, we've been blocked. We don't know who is the one which department, although it was under the defense. Now I don't know which department it falls under. So that is just my little bit input, because grassroots, we really, really need help in relation to where we stay in Region G of Johannesburg. I thank you.
Thank you, Soraya. Any more questions? Tsahofatso, you may come on.
Thank you. Well, I'm just a researcher in this space, and I've been listening very carefully to the discussion. One question that keeps coming back to me is, how do we move from talking about a just transition to actually defining what the word just means? It's like, it's just for whom? Because we can talk about technological transitions, renewable energy, green industrialization, climate finance, and regional development. But I think we also need to ask who is actually benefiting from these transitions and who may still be left behind, like particularly from the perspective of energy poverty. How do we ensure that communities that currently struggle to access reliable and affordable energy are not simply like passive beneficiaries, but are part of designing, implementing, and benefiting from the solutions? Like, for me, that is where we really need to interrogate what we mean when we say just transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tsahofatso. Very, very important questions. Any other takers before we move back to the speakers? Iggy, you may come on.
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity, as well as thank you very much to all the speakers for such wonderful inputs. Yeah, I was listening, and really I was getting all the gems from the speakers, and I really appreciate being here. So one of my main questions goes to Fundai. I liked how you spoke about positioning how a child is thinking now. So, and how we can deliberately contextualize just transition in that manner. So one of my questions relates to something similar to that. So because we frequently hear that young people must be at the center of just transition, but we realize that beyond consultations, conferences, or even seminars and representations, what I need to understand is, what decisions do you think that young people should have the power to influence on? And how do you think that we can ensure youth participation really translates into economic opportunities? So essentially what I'm asking is, how do you think we can move beyond having that scapegoated youth representation to a point where we have young people participate and have that contribution towards economic opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iggy. Any more questions coming from Sive? You may proceed.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear. You may proceed.
All right, cool. Thanks, man.
Sive, you've muted yourself. Seems we have technical problems with Sive there. Any other takers for questions while Sive is getting his net? Anadi Sululu?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Or is it good morning, wherever you are? Yeah, thank you for the sterling presentations. Yeah, mine is just a simple question or introduction. My name is Anadi Sululu, a former legislator from Zimbabwe, and I'm a director of an institution called GISA, Governance Initiative of Southern Africa. My direct question is to any one of you. It's just to say, how can the regional climate policies address climate-induced migrations and displacement across national bodies? In national countries, we've seen a number of countries like Zimbabwe there in the eastern borders. We had a disaster some years ago, and a lot of people encroaching into South Africa. So I would like to know if there's any policies pertaining to such instances. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Anadi. The SADC, yesterday, the SADC current chairperson, Mr. Ronald Lamola, when he spoke about the issues around climate change, highlighted the situation in Mozambique. And one of the key critical issues that SADC has, it has not operationalized something called the SADC Humanitarian Emergency Operations Center. And part and parcel of that is part of the SADC emergency response towards climate issues. So some of the civil society recommendations linked towards the critical minerals initiative that civil society has been putting forward has been that there should be creation of a critical mineral sovereign wealth fund for the region to deal with issues around mitigation and adaptation of climate-related disasters within the region. And obviously, the SADC leaders have now want to interlink this with the notion of regional infrastructure, which the notions of regional infrastructure are linked with creating of beltways and value chains infrastructure for regional trade. And that's from yesterday's deliberations from the ministers within the SADC region. But I would like to move on back to our panelists. If there are no other questions, Sive is back on. Sive, you may come back on. Sive, you may unmute yourself.
All right. Hey, that was network, man. Yes.
Thank you.
My question is basically framed from climate finance. So, as I was saying, that like apart from the potential socio-economic benefits that comes with like just transitions, local communities like have a potential to contribute towards decarbonization initiatives, and the aspect of climate finance is always favors the large-scale projects as well as developed economies. So I would like to know where are the community-led initiatives are positioned during this transitioning as well as the funding mechanisms.
Thank you, Sive. I'd like, is this a legacy hand, or do you want a second bite, or you forgot something? Iggy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Yes, sure. I would like to
Absolutely.
just I can
Yeah.
ask another question. Really, I think it was okay. It was from the previous, but yeah, I think I can ask another question, which I thought I spoke from the last round. Yes, so my name
Oh,
is Iggy. Yes, also I work with young innovators because I work in the science, technology, and innovation space. So my question goes to Dr. Amis. Yeah, so I like how you spoke about transitioning, unfolding in an environment with challenges and how it should be not treated in isolation, but come up with some sort of an multi-sectoral model. So I want to understand how would that look like in practice? Because I understand that transition and a just transition will require really significant investment. So, from your understanding, who do you think should carry that initial cost? Whether it should be the state, or should it be the private sector, or should it be the financial institutions? Should it be the communities? What kind of a financial model do you think Southern Africa needs in order to achieve that just transition and uplift that economic opportunity? Thank you very much.
thank you so much, Iggy, for your input. Moving on back to the panelists, I would like to start off with Boitumelo, and then go to Dr. Amis, and then Kundai, and then Ndombi for the responses. Boitumelo, taking into consideration the inputs by the panelists and the participants, what are the worker perspectives on what should the SADC leaders come out with during South Africa's SADC summit, along with taking to realization that a just transition will require a lot of capacity building within the state, as highlighted within the chat. What are the workers' perspectives around state capacity building to respond to a just transition and climate change? Over to you, Boitumelo.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and thank you to the colleagues for the very good questions that have been asked. I think for us as COSATU, it's been clear, now, like we have one mandate to make sure that this transition is not only towards a low carbon economy, but is one that is going to ensure that workers are active participants in the just transition. And I think it's very clear that we would want to see initiatives, even at the level of SADC, to be considerate of workers and how they need to really be at the front line of this transition and be assisted to transition adequately in terms of job skills, and other socio-economic aspects of this just transition. So it's really about making sure that workers are at the forefront, and in all platforms that we would then speak about workers, it's clear. We strongly believe in the capacity of workers and that they are the ones that should be bringing solutions, especially because they are at face value of this transition across sectors. This is a multi-sectoral transition that requires all of us to be hands on deck. And I think it's quite clear that the state for us is the only possible avenue that we can have this transition be done through. While we appreciate that there would be some instances where there would need to be partnership, ours is to make sure that the state has the adequate vigor, capacity, and ability to be able to help us towards a low carbon economy. For instance, you would have seen in the media currently, the National Union of Mine Workers, which is an affiliate of COSATU, is speaking about the capacity of Eskom as a state entity to provide affordable, reliable electricity for all South Africans. So you see, with us, it's clear. The state must take its role in ensuring that the just transition actually takes place. The just transition does not have to be just a project-based initiative, as we are seeing with various funders from across the world coming into areas like Mpumalanga and treating the just transition as only a project that is fulfilling their objectives. The objectives for us need to be developmental in nature. The state needs to have the capacity to do it, and the state across the board, not only state entities like Eskom, but Treasury needs to be on board. The DTIC needs to be on board. The Department of Electricity needs to be on board, as well as the DFFE. We need to see that collaboration and that strength within the state to be able to achieve a just transition. It can only happen through the state's ability to be able to move society into this transition. We've seen several transitions take place, and in fact, currently are going through various other transitions. So it needs to be led by the state with a developmental perspective from it, and Treasury needs to be on board. While we understand that the funding of the transition and the funding models that have been introduced are really mostly based on foreign investments, grants, concessional loans, etc. We strongly believe that the Treasury needs to somewhat get us into a point where we are able to fund the transition from the state coffers. While we understand the debt to GDP, we understand the state's inability to fully fund the transition, but there needs to be some sort of initiative that comes from the state's treasury so that we are able to get that grounding and are able to make sure that the transition is not foreign-led, it's not through multiple loans, and it's able to assist us as workers, as communities, to move to this low-carbon economy. It's a collaborative effort. We all need to be part of it, through regions, through country to country and other engagements. It needs to be collaborative, but also has to be grounded with the aspect of development and the aspect of ensuring that workers' communities are not left behind and are not left just only to be spectators or to be receivers of whatever initiatives that would come into place. So it's important that we understand that it is not just about having private institutions or foreign-led institutions pushing for this just transition. It is really about us being at the forefront as South Africans, aligning to documents and initiatives that the PCC has created so far in terms of that framework on just transition, which also grounds it into being a very specific South African-led transition. So I think for us, we are very clear that workers and communities have the capacity, and we are leading in terms of policy development. And I will agree that some of the implementation has not taken place quite strongly, but I think we're well on our way to doing that with the right collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boitumelo. Dr. Amias, there are a number of questions presented by the audience. Would you care to illuminate on them and probably give your closing remarks for the discussion? Over to you, Dr. Amias.
Thank you very much, and to the audience for such an engaging session. Really appreciate this. So there's a couple of issues that were raised. I'll try to apply my mind to them, and I'll group them into, I would say, three categories. One is the broader issue around energy access and affordability issues. Then there is a second question, which broadly, I think, the private sector participation. I combine that with the climate finance, and then the third category was the issue raised around regional climate policy related to refugees and youth engagement, etc. So the truth is that, you know, there is issues around energy access is basically governed by two critical issues. And South Africa, for example, 80% of households have access to the national grid. But South Africa is regarded as energy poor. After about 47% of South Africans are regarded as energy poor. And that's partly because of affordability issues. So affordability is a very critical issue in South Africa. Whereas if you go to the rest of the continent, let's say East Africa, Uganda, for example, the challenge there is different, is that, you know, 80% of the population does not have access to the grid. So they actually are energy poor in relation to access, to lack of access. So the point I'm trying to drive here is that we cannot talk about the transition or renewable energy access if purely planning is based on households' ability to purchase, let's say, solar panels, inverters, batteries, etc. Basically, what that does is that we're essentially transferring the responsibility for energy provision to those who are least able to carry the cost. wealthier households, can reduce their dependency on the grid, and they can protect themselves. We have seen that through the load shedding, and particularly in Cape Town, where I am based, in the neighborhoods, at least 50% of households area within the neighborhood has some level of solar panels because they can afford. But we cannot outsource the cost of the transition to the poor. And in many cases, we have seen that poor households are still trapped in poverty. I've done work in Katu, in the Northern Cape, where there's massive renewable energy power plants, but the neighboring communities have never in their lifetime actually had power in their households. So there's an issue around how do we make energy affordable, and on the one hand, but also how do we ensure that it's accessible for those areas that do not have those access. And there's a couple of potential solutions. One is that we have to have targeted subsidies that would essentially cover the cost to those poorest households, and we've seen it here and there in South Africa, but I think that needs to be amplified. And in this case, public finance and climate finance could play a very important role in terms of ensuring that the poorest of the poor do not bear the burden of the transition. And the second thing we've seen in East Africa, for example, renewable energy access models such as pay as you go or lease to own. These are basically very basic renewable energy technologies that traditionally households will not be able to afford. But because of these payment models that allow you to access these technologies at a subsidized rate, will enable communities to be able to access these issues. For me, I think the key issue is that we have to plan with the poor in mind. If we don't take consideration that there are people who are not going to be able to afford the cost of the electricity, many people are going to be left behind. And that for me is really a very, very important challenge. And particularly when you talk about how tariffs are designed, we have to design tariffs around ability to pay. I live in Cape Town, where if your rates, your municipal rates are in arrears, the city automatically cuts. If you're a prepaid household, they will take 90% of the your prepaid voucher to cater for the municipal rate. And when you're thinking about a situation where unemployment is 33%, we're basically planning against the poor. And for me, that's the point, is that we cannot plan for tariffs without thinking about the affordability issues around free basic access to electricity and so on. So the issue around energy access is very central to this conversation. And if we don't watch out, we will leave many people behind. But there are ways of how I think the one could get across this. But this whole discussion around energy access, it can come endless at times. In relation to climate finance, and if someone asked about what kind of models do we need to implement to advance the transition, and broadly also around the role of the private sector, I think what we need to acknowledge, and I think I never said it in my previous section, that private capital is necessary. It's absolutely critical for the transition. But it cannot be the only source of capital. It's insufficient. And we also know that private capital will favor bankable opportunities and cannot be expected to finance all public goods, social protection, or early stage project development. And like Boitumela has said here, that we need to own this process. The public sector need to advance in this. Otherwise, we risk being dictated to by outside forces. But having said that, I think that the models that really work is this idea around blended finance. Because like I've said, an investor is not going to put his investment in an early stage project that has no proven return on investment. But public finance can be used to de-risk projects. Public finance could be used to undertake initial investments that are required to prepare a project for investment. And so what that requires is that you need significant investment from the public sector, and we've seen that in terms of the climate finance, recognizing that the private sector has a role, but it plays a role at a certain level. I think I do a masterclass on climate finance, and I always say that, you know, in the sector, people always assume that climate finance is this specific quantum of money that is sitting somewhere that needs to be accessed. And I would argue that is not necessarily the case. Really, climate finance has to come from different sources. We cannot say the transition is going to be 100% addressed through grant funding mechanisms, because if we insist on that, then capital is not going to be able to come onto the table. But for me, what I say is that climate finance is actually how do you stack together these existing means of finance, whether it's grant-based funding, concessional loans, venture capital, and so on. How do you stack them in a way that responds to the investor's needs? So we know, for example, concessional loans, these are more higher risk appetite. So they can be in developing projects, they can go into the initial design of an initiative. Once a project has been proven beyond the concept node, then you can seek to unlock other forms of capital that are risk averse. You can bring in private sector investors. You can bring in, even venture capital and so on. But it's how you stack capital is the only way you can, one, ensure that the transition is holistic, economy-wide, and brings together the different stakeholders to drive the change. I think that for me, the biggest worry in this conversation oftentimes is this dichotomy of us against them. You know, private sector against civil society against public sector. We have to hold hands, knowing that every sector has its own needs, has its own interest, but we have one economy, we have one planet. We all face some level of shared risk, and putting together our resources is the only way that we can be able to fix those challenges. My final parting shot, I definitely think that youth engagement is absolutely critical, and it's very admirable over the years how we have seen youth participating in this discourse, particularly around climate change negotiations, how they've taken a very central role. Last year in Brazil at COP30, I was very impressed when I attended a ministerial meeting where almost 90% of the ministers, from Cote d'Ivoire, from various parts of the world, they're all very young people. Young as in, less than under 40. There were guys who were like 29 as ministers, really taking decisions that are very crucial. So for me, I don't think that I think that youth have made significant progress in terms of making sure that young people are participating, and it's something that must be applauded, and more platforms need to be created for young people to take leadership of some of these issues. And in closing, my closing remark is that if I were to leave one message, is that Southern Africa's transition will not be just merely because we call it just. Will not be just merely because we call it just. Justice must be designed, must be financed, implemented, and measured. It must be visible in both decisions, in who makes decisions, who owns assets, who gets jobs and contracts, who carries the risk, and where the affected places emerge with stronger and more diversified outcomes. I always say, go to your township and see, has the township changed from when you left it, if you have already left it, if you left your township, or is it still the same, 5 years ago? If it is still the same, it means that we have not made any much progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Amis, for insightful inputs and trying to shape a way forward in this discussion. And hopefully we'll invite you back in the near future. I would like to move on to Kondai for your response to some of the questions and your closing inputs to the meeting, please. Over to you, Kondai.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just try to be brief as we come to a close. I'll start by responding to the question around young people to say, what decisions do you think young people should actually have the power to influence, or should actually have in order to be able to amplify their power to influence? One of the things I would actually say in response to that is that there is need for young people to be able to establish networks, task force, consortiums, and all that, because the only way you'll be able to influence is when you are coming through or you utilizing a collective front or a collective mechanism. Let's say, for instance, you are to establish a position paper, declaration, whatever it is, and it has been signed on by, let's say, 100 organizations that are dotted across South Africa, maybe Zimbabwe, whichever context. It's easier for that paper to then be taken into consideration, unlike when maybe organization A, network A, organization B is trying to advance for the same cause. So this has been something that I feel as young people, the moment you're like-minded or working around a certain cause, come together. At the same time, when it comes to governance issues, I'm also speaking from a point of experience, because I'm also a young person. Governance issues, it's necessary to understand the timing of things. Let's say, for example, right now, the COP will be coming in November. But if you are to make a submission or input towards, let's say, in end of October, you are then to or maybe let's say beginning of November, you have come up with your inputs and you want them to be taken up into the country statement. The country statement would already been done and dusted or sorted out or waiting somewhere else, waiting for people to go and present. So timing now also becomes very critical in terms of how we present our initiatives or our thoughts and inputs. And of course, we mustn't wait for the right time, because sometimes the right time will never come. But even an elevator, knowing the right person whom you're supposed to speak to, whom you've just engaged, can actually be utilized to share our thoughts. Therefore, our thoughts must not remain on paper, but also at our fingertips or in something like that, because the person you are looking for, you could see them not in an informal setting. So I think those are some of the decisions that, or the aspects that young people could also try to think around. And then how do we ensure that youth participation translates into economic opportunities? There's this aspect of holding people accountable. If somebody says opportunities are here, or maybe so and so organization or entity, they are working around this, then it's a matter of then holding them accountable to say, you have spoken about this or you've presented about this, where can we access this? At the same time, and another aspect also is that some of the youth engagement initiatives, they are non-profit making, so there's also need to then also advocate for that, to then say, as much as we are looking for bankable projects, profit making initiatives, how also this is what we have, how can what we have be positioned in this or also discourse? So again, the aspect of collectiveness becomes critical. And then also one highlighted the essence of, so how then do we then define this just transition aspect? This year saw the first ever transitioning away from fossil fuel conference. And one of the things that I took from that in terms of mechanisms of how do we put sectors together, sectors were all asked to come up with their own statements, declarations, and all that, or their priorities or demands. Then there was the aspect of then synthesis to be able to bring all those together. So I'm sure the aspect of making sure that we understand some of these governance processes, what happens where and how, and then we start to work within sectors, and then we try and look for common ground within sectors to be able to push it forward or to advance. It can also assist in terms of defining this just transition. And lastly, something that we just need to note around the aspects of these climate negotiations and all that. When we look at the AGN, the AGN, it's not a legally binding group. It's a group. It's more like a network that is coming together. So these are some of the issues that also as Southern Africa, we ought then to be able to advocate, so that at least from Southern Africa, we try and make sure that our position is coming in an aligned manner as we head towards these negotiations, so that if somebody says A, no one would then raise their hand or their placard or whichever context to then say B, because we'll still be moving around in the same context, or still within the same means, or still within the same kind of negotiating, where we are just trying to understand, maybe to come to terms with the wording, or with initiatives, or with numbers and all that. So yeah, I guess for the sake of time, I will end it here. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Kundai, for your brilliant contributions to this discussion, and enlightening us on what we need to do, both as non-state actors and what governments need to do in order to address issues around the just transition and climate justice. I would like to move on to Ntombi for your response to some of the questions and comments and your closing remarks to this discussion. Over to you, Ntombi.
Thank you so much, Lozzie. I just want to perhaps just touch on the question that Tseho asked, and just to around how to ensure that the transition is truly just, particularly from an economic and also community-based perspective. And I think one of the things that we should, from a regional perspective, is that we should work on, or try to advocate for, regional cooperation and climate finance that truly serves the marginalized. And we should look at that from three perspectives. I think the first three core pillars for intervention. I think the first one is advocating for energy democracy and local ownership. And that is ensuring that, or we must work towards ensuring that there is a prioritization of the decentralization of energy systems. So instead of relying solely on centralized grid-dependent infrastructure, and infrastructure that benefits incumbent monopolies, we must champion socially owned renewable energy systems. And we also work on supporting decentralized mini grids and community-owned solar installations. And I know that Tseho does a lot of work around that. So importantly, that's to ensure that the power to generate and manage and distribute energy remains with local communities. This not only builds resilience against outages, but also ensures that economic benefits, such as reduced costs and local job creations, remain within the community. Secondly, we need to look at restorative climate finance, and what does that look like, and how does it look like for communities. So across the region, climate finance must be treated as a debt of injustice, not a vehicle for further profit making. So we need to move away from debt-inducing loans towards grant-based financing that prioritize the health and well-being of frontline communities. And this finance should be explicitly targeted at addressing energy poverty, providing clean cooking solutions, and funding community-based adaptation projects in areas that are historically marginalized, especially by the mineral energy complex. And thirdly, we should look at integrating social and gender responsive governance. So this a transition is only just if it is inclusive by design and not by accident. This means that implementing legally binding frameworks for free, prior, and informed consent that empower communities to reject predatory projects. Furthermore, I think we must look at how gender is centered, or gender responsive, how we center gender responsive decision making. Particularly acknowledging that the Black working class woman is disproportionately affected and suffers the impacts of energy poverty and climate change. So policies must explicitly mitigate these burdens by ensuring that the transition benefits, such as decentralized clean energy, directly reduces the cost and labor associated with household benefits. And I think as part of that, I think we must talk about how the current paradigm often prioritizes macroeconomic gains, fossil fuel-driven growth, or large-scale corporate-led renewable projects that frequently bypass communities that bear the greatest burden of energy poverty and environmental degradation. So I think those are some of the conversations that we need to have. Maybe we can have another webinar that looks at that. And another question that also came to my mind was the question that was asked by Nyasha around clean cooking. And my view on that is that addressing clean cooking fuels is an essential extension of energy democracy and also gender responsive governance. It's not merely an infrastructure issue, it's a critical health and safety issue and a gender justice priority that demands immediate policy intervention. So these are some of the conversations that we need to advocate for when we speak with our governments or submitting policy positions, because a truly just transition must prioritize decentralized, safe, and affordable cooking energy solutions that directly alleviate the disproportionate burdens borne by women and children in marginalized communities, ensuring that the fundamental right to clean energy reaches the heart of every home. So in essence, we need to, as communities, take our tools and ensure that our voices are included in advocating and defining and designing the type of transition that we want. Currently, the work is being done by governments, but we need to ensure that we involve ourselves. We need to define it from ground up, what this transition looks like and how we want to be active participants in a transition that is defined by us and for us. So thank you so much, Rosie. I appreciate it. Thanks to the SALO team.
Thank you so much, Ndombi, for your amazing inputs. And the intersectional approach towards climate justice is very important in order for us to deal with the fundamentals that face with our societies and communities. And our speakers today really highlighted not only the complexities around the debate around a just transition, but also how we as civil society actors can plug in our voices within the debate and to truly determine the future. As we know, the international community itself is in flux, whilst people generally perceive this as a doom and gloom, but it's a great window of opportunity to influence debates at an international level that impact people at a grassroots level. This is why it is very important that we convene these discussions as civil society actors and various actors such as the trade union movements and even within our governments to deliberate and build consensus within this continent, to build agency amongst us as Africans, to define our own future when it comes to these important international debates. And fundamentally, we as SALO plan to contribute towards creating platforms for us to build consensus amongst various actors within both South Africa, the region, but the continent as a whole. I would like to thank our panelists for today for those fascinating, informative, and agitating inputs for today that has nourished our brains in order for us to think on what the pathways going forward for us as civil society actors within the region itself. And as our leaders deliberate, may our continued momentum throughout the coming years continue to influence our leaders, not only at a SADC level, but also at a continental level, to take agency as Africans and to define what a just solution is for us going forward. So thank you to each and every single person. I would like to hand over to, I'm not sure who will be doing the vote of thanks from the SALO team. Amahle will be giving a vote of thanks, and I would like to hand over to Amahle. Thank you. Over to you, Amahle.
Thank you, Razi. I would like to express our sincere appreciation to all our speakers for sharing their time, expertise, and perspectives with us today. The range of contributions have reflected the breadth of just transition agenda and the importance of bringing different sectors and experiences into the same conversation. Thank you as well to everyone who joined the dialogue and contributed through questions, comments, and reflections. These exchanges are strengthened by active participation and by a willingness to engage openly and constructively, including where perspectives may differ. Today's discussion has also shown that no single dialogue can resolve the many policy and practical questions surrounding just transition. It can, however, deepen understanding, strengthen relationships, and help ensure that workers, communities, young people, and civil society remain part of the decisions shaping the region's future. We also extend our sincere gratitude to Norwegian People's Aid for its continued support of SALO's work and for helping to make today's engagement possible. The support enables SALO to continue creating inclusive spaces for informed dialogue and regional exchange. Thank you to Lwazi Somya and Marisa van Risbeck for chairing and guiding the session, and to the SALO team for their work behind the scenes. As noted at the beginning of the meeting, today's dialogue was recorded and will be available on SALO's YouTube channel after the session. We encourage you to continue engaging with SALO's work and future dialogues. On behalf of SALO, thank you once again for your time and participation. We look forward to continuing these conversations and to supporting inclusive, practical, and regionally informed approaches to a just transition in Southern Africa. I wish you all a pleasant afternoon. This meeting is now officially closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, SALO.